Okay, so I'm going to go through this is chapter 16, and we're going to be talking about blood in particular. We've already gone through the cardiovascular system in terms of the heart and the blood vessels, and now we're going to talk about actual blood. And blood involves both blood cells and blood plasma. Okay, so we're going to talk about the different types of blood cells that are in there, the production of blood cells, specifically from pluripotent stem cells that can be any kind of blood cell, but not necessarily any kind of cell. And then we'll talk about red blood cells and hemoglobin and platelets and clotting. We'll also talk about the different types of white blood cells. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about the different types of blood cells. Okay, so to start with that, blood is composed of, first of all, there's plasma, which is the liquid part of blood, and we'll say more about that in a minute. But the cellular elements, so these are the cells that are in blood, include red blood cells, which we should be familiar with because they're the ones that carry oxygen. They have hemoglobin and they carry oxygen. And then the white blood cells, which are involved in immunity, and then platelets, which are involved in clotting. So we can see that red blood cells, also called erythrocytes, okay? So erythropoietin is the hormone that's made that causes you to produce more red blood cells. EPO, you've heard about that if um, athletes and stuff will take synthetic forms of EPO, erythropoietin, to increase their red blood cells or increase their oxygen carrying capacity. And then the platelets split off from a larger cell called a megakaryocyte. I like that name. And then white blood cells are also called leukocytes. Okay, and that is involved in immunity. So if we look at this, this is pretty simple. Like I said, the platelets are derived from a larger cell called a megakaryocyte. Okay, and that just basically flakes off and forms these little chunks called platelets, or sometimes they're called thrombocytes because they're involved in clotting, thrombosis. Okay, and then the red blood cells are just red blood cells. Okay, so those are where that ends. Okay, however, the white blood cells, there are a lot of different white blood cells. There are lymphocytes, which, if you're familiar with some immunity, those include B cells and T cells, which those show up. They're called lymphocytes because they are found in the lymph. Okay, they're found in, specifically, there are lots of them in the lymph nodes. Okay, and then monocytes, which turn into something called macrophages. Okay, and macrophages are cells that will engulf or phagocytose bacteria and other foreign substances. And then neutrophils. Neutrophils are the main white blood cell that is circulating in your blood right now. These are the first responders. And then there's something called eosinophils. Eosinophils are more for, there aren't as many of them. They're involved in allergic responses along with basophils. These are both involved in allergic responses. So that's what's produced, and they release histamine. But eosinophils are special because they also release a compound that will kill things like parasites, parasitic worms, things like that. So if you're ever infected with some kind of a parasite like a worm, then eosinophils are activated and they're able to kill those. Okay, and like I said, basophils are primarily, we think about those in terms of allergies. Okay, so if we look at the blood in general, it's about 55%, about 58% blood plasma, okay, and about 42%. So we usually say it's about 45% red blood cells, 55% blood plasma, but specifically 58% blood plasma, that's the liquid part, and then 45 or 42% red blood cells. And then there aren't very many white blood cells, less than 1% white blood cells. And like I said, of the white blood cells, of that very small percentage, most of these are neutrophils. Okay, so let's look at some other terms. Hematocrit. Okay, so because red blood cells carry oxygen, we want to know how many red blood cells we have, because that has a big effect on how much energy you have, how much you can sustain activity and things like that. In fact, if we don't have enough red blood cells, or if our oxygen carrying capacity is low, we call that anemia, and usually that makes us very tired. Okay, so hematocrit is, and this is very important, is the percentage of total blood volume that is occupied by red blood cells. Red blood cells. So this part down here, okay? Not including the white blood cells. That is your hematocrit, this part right here. Okay? So that's an important term. Hemoglobin, which is inside red blood cells. And then some other terms we won't be talking about, but there's also red blood cell count. They can count it in a special way where they send it through a beam of light. And then total white count. Now, when you read somebody's labs or something like that, you'll get a total white blood cell count, and if that's elevated, remember what white blood cells are for. They're for immunity. So if that's elevated, then that usually means someone is fighting off an infection. Okay, so if they have an elevated white blood cell count, that means that something in their immune system has triggered the division and reproduction of white blood cells to fight off that infection. So we can see that someone has an infection if they have an increased white blood cell count. Okay, and here are the rest that we went through. The eosinophils, remember those were worms. Basophils associated with allergies, and then the lymphocytes, which are found in the lymph nodes, and those are what we usually think of as things like that are making a immune response, like if you get a flu virus or something like that, the lymphocytes, T cells and B cells, the B cells will turn into plasma cells and make antibodies. Okay, so that's what those are. And then the monocytes, which are also they're in there trying to get the bacteria and stuff like that as it enters your body. Okay, and then finally we have platelets. Okay, platelets that are involved in clotting. Okay. All right, so we term the production of blood cells in general, okay, I want to be very, very clear. The production of blood cells is hematopoiesis, okay? The production of white blood cells, so we can break that down and we can say, okay, this is all blood cells, hematopoiesis, but what about just white blood cells? We call that leukopoiesis. Okay, so for leukocytes. Leukocytes are another word for white blood cells. And erythropoiesis is red blood cells, the production of red blood cells, okay, or erythrocytes. Erythrocytes is another word for red blood cells, okay. And again, just to clarify this term, hematocrit, that's the ratio of red blood cells to plasma, okay, so that's just red blood cells, okay. Okay, and that's important again because red blood cells carry our oxygen. Okay, so we make a hormone, the kidneys make a hormone called erythropoietin, and that hormone then travels to the bone marrow where red blood cells are made, and it will increase the number of red blood cells. There's also something called thrombopoietin, which produces thrombocytes or platelets, and that will then activate the megakaryocytes. The megakaryocytes are the things that are making those platelets. Okay, and then we have other factors involved as well that can produce all types of white blood cells, and there are a number of these. We don't have to know them all, but they also have an effect on the production of these. So to get us a better picture, so we can kind of see what's going on, we start out with a stem cell, and most books call this a pluripotent stem cell, okay, as opposed to like a totipotent or something like that. Pluripotent stem cells, and pay attention to this, they can become white blood cells, red blood cells, or platelets, and that's it. Okay, they can't become cardiac muscle cells. They can't become brain cells. They're stem cells, but they've differentiated to the point where these are all they can become. So these guys sit in the bone marrow. Okay, so this is in the bone marrow, and these guys will sit in the bone marrow and they wait until they get those signals that says, oh, okay, we've released erythropoietin. That means we need to start activating this stem cell, and it will divide, and one of those divisions will differentiate and keep differentiating and maturing until it forms a red blood cell. Now, I want to point something out here too, and I'm going to point this out again, but this has a nucleus, but then a red blood cell, just before it becomes an active red blood cell, it will spit out its nucleus. Okay, so that means the red blood cell itself doesn't have a nucleus. And can you think of a reason why it wouldn't want to have a nucleus? Well, since its job is to carry oxygen, this nucleus just takes up space. And so if it gets rid of the nucleus, that red blood cell can carry even more oxygen, and that's very, very important. Okay, so this same stem cell that produced the red blood cell, the same stem cell with a different signal could say, okay, we're going to make a neutrophil. Remember, neutrophils are the most common white blood cell. Okay, um, or they can make macrophages. They can make anything. And they can also differentiate to form these megakaryocytes, and this is a megakaryocyte here. That's why it's called that. It's huge, and it's just one big cell that's like chunking off flakes, and these flakes are platelets. Okay, all right, and those are also circulating through your blood, just waiting to form clots. Okay, so let's talk about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin. Okay. Um, Hemoglobin it's a protein. Okay, so it's largely a protein. It has 4 subunits, and this is very, very important. Okay, so look at this protein. This is one hemoglobin molecule right here. That's one hemoglobin molecule, and the globulin, that refers to the protein part. But there's also this little molecule called a heme group, and that's what this is showing. Okay, it's a molecule, and it sits right inside each of these 4 subunits. So that means it has 4 heme groups. Okay, so one hemoglobin molecule, which is a protein primarily, has 4 heme groups. Okay, and at the center, and this is very important because, as we know, we've heard of things like iron poor blood, and if you try to give blood and you have low iron, they won't let you do it. There's also anemia that's caused by a lack of iron, and that's so simple because sitting right at the center, we'll go here, they drew an arrow too, but right at the center is an iron molecule. And do you know what that iron molecule does? The job of that iron molecule is to bind oxygen. Okay, so I have a question about that, and I'll have a question about it on the exam too. The job of that iron, that is exactly where the oxygen binds. So if you don't have enough iron, you're not going to get the binding of the oxygen. You're not going to be able to complete this heme group, and therefore you're not going to have the hemoglobin, and so you become anemic. Your oxygen carrying capacity goes down. But it's very important that you understand that this iron that sits in the middle is carrying an oxygen molecule. Okay, so there are 4 of these, 2, 3, 4, which means that you can carry 4 oxygens. Okay, all right, so let's talk a little bit more about red blood cells, get some details that you need to know. They have no nucleus. Okay, so we saw that in the previous picture. They have no nucleus because that leaves them more room to fit more of this hemoglobin into the blood. Okay, so into the blood cell, the red blood cell. So get rid of that nucleus. The problem is that the nucleus is what allows a cell to survive. Okay, it allows the cell to make new things as proteins die and stuff like that. Proteins degrade. It can turn on the DNA to make more proteins, and that can keep a cell around for a long time. The trouble is, without the nucleus, red blood cells only last about 4 months. Okay, 120 days. That's it, and then they die. Now, most of it can be recycled. The hemoglobin part, it's just a protein, so it can break those down into its individual amino acids, and it can make new proteins. It can make a new hemoglobin. It can make any protein at once, right? The iron is recycled, so some iron from the heme groups are reused in new heme groups. But the heme group itself is a lot of times just converted into something called bilirubin. Okay, so remember this name, bilirubin, because we're going to see that again when we start talking about the liver and the gallbladder and digestion, because this bilirubin is excreted usually as feces. Okay, and it's broken down into some other things. Stercobilin, which gives feces its brown color. It's urobilin that gives urine, because it can also go through the kidneys. Um, and we'll give urine its yellow color. Now, because most of it's processed by the liver, if your liver isn't functioning, then this bilirubin, which has a yellowish color without being broken down, will it'll cause yellowing of your skin or in your eyes or something like that. You'll start to see yellowing, and we call this jaundice. Okay, so if the question is, where does bilirubin come from? Well, bilirubin is a broken down heme group. Okay, so your blood cells are constantly being produced, and they're constantly breaking down, and they're constantly producing bilirubin. Bilirubin is excreted in bile from the liver. We'll say more about that when we talk about the digestive system. Okay, so let's look again at the megakaryocytes. Okay, so there's the megakaryocyte. There's this huge nucleus with a lot of many copies of the DNA. But the platelets themselves actually don't have any DNA. They don't have a nucleus because they're just chunks. They're just chunks of this large cell. Okay, so I'll just say that's the nucleus there that sits inside, and it just chunks off little pieces, and each of these little pieces has clotting factors that can be activated when they're exposed to usually collagen or something that's not supposed to be in the blood. Okay, so if they get exposed to something, specifically collagen, that's not supposed to be in the blood, then they will start to stick together and they'll form, and this is what this is showing, they'll all stick together and they'll form a well, this is one that's been activated, and you can see that it's like this little piece of Velcro, and it'll start sticking to each other, and it forms a big clot. Okay, to try to stop the blood flow. Okay, so let's look at how that happens. Okay, and so here are the platelets. Here are the platelets that are just kind of moving through. They're inactive platelets, and they're all over. They're kind of dotted throughout your blood, and they're much smaller than the blood cells themselves. Blood cells themselves might be about this big, and then you have a break. So you have a cut or something damages the wall of the capillary or the vessel or whatever it is, and there's this layer of collagen that sits right there. As soon as this collagen is exposed, these guys are activated, and you can see that they're pretty smooth in this case, but then down here they sort of take on this star-shaped appearance, and that's what we saw here. They take on this other appearance that makes them more sticky. So it actually changes what we would say the morphology of them, and it also activates some other binding features, and they will then start to stick together and start to stick to the collagen and start to stick to everything else, and including each other, and they'll start to form a plug or a platelet plug. Well, that platelet plug then activates another protein called fibrin. Okay, and this fibrin will then start to form around it, and it sometimes traps red blood cells, it traps everything in there, and then it forms a clot, and that's what we see as like a scab or something like that. We see a fibrin mesh with a bunch of platelets that are stuck together and some red blood cells, giving it that red color, and that's what a clot is. Okay, so that's pretty much all we have in terms of the red blood cells, or I'm sorry, blood in general. So hopefully that's enough.